Good morning. I'm running a little behind today. I decided to walk to school because it was raining, and I like walking in the rain. And then I got halfway here and realized I forgot my computer at the house. So I walked all the way home and then walked back. So we're running a little behind, but that's all right. Got some exercise in. Our next book is called The Adventure of the Copper Beaches. Sorry, the next story in our book is called The Adventure of the Copper Beaches. And it's spelled Beeches, not like the beach, like with ocean and sand and everything. I think this is like how the tree is spelled, maybe. Beach, like the beech tree? I'm not sure. I guess we'll find out. Alright, so it was a cold spring morning, and Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson were sitting on their side of a cherry fireplace on the sitting room of 221B Baker Street. A thick fog made the houses outside look dark, shapeless blurs. The gas lamps were lit, and by its light, Holmes was studying a classified advertisement column of various newspapers. Finally, having given up his search, he threw the last paper down and sat back, smoking his long pipe and gazing into the fire. "I fear, Watson," he said glumly, "that my practice has come down to finding lost lead lead pencils and giving advice to young ladies from boarding schools. I think that I have hit bottom at last with this note I received from a boarding school this morning." Holmes took a crumpled letter from the pocket of his dressing gown and tossed it across to Watson. "It is dated last night," said Watson, "and it reads, 'I am very anxious to ask your advice as to whether or not I should accept the position offered to me as governess. I shall call at 10:30 tomorrow morning if that is convenient for you.' And it is signed Violet Hunter. Do you know the young lady, Holmes?" "Certainly not," exclaimed Holmes, "but since it is 10:30 now, I would assume that the footsteps I hear in the hallway are Miss Hunter's." Just then the door opened and a plain but neatly dressed young lady entered the room. She had a bright-looking face covered with freckles, and she walked with the self-assurance of a woman who is accustomed to making her own way in the world. As Holmes and Watson rose to greet her, Violet Hunter spoke. "Please excuse my troubling you, Mr. Holmes, but since I've had a very strange experience, and since I have no parents or family from whom to seek advice, I thought of coming to you." "Do sit down, Miss Hunter, and tell Dr. Watson and me your story," said Holmes, who seemed impressed with the young woman. "For the past 5 years," she said, "I have been a governess to the child of Colonel Spence Munro," explained Miss Hunter, "but 2 months ago the colonel was transferred to a post in Canada. Although I have been trying to find another position during this time, I have not been successful. What little money I have saved began to run out." Have you answered classified ads for any governess position?" asked Watson. Answer them and place several myself, sir," said Miss Hunter, "but with no success." "And have you tried employment agencies?" asked Holmes. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. Miss Staper's agency is quite well known for specializing in governess positions, and I have been checking with them every week. When I stopped in last week, I was shown into Miss Taper's office. A rather stout, smiling man was seated next to her desk. As I entered, he saw me. He turned to his chair with a start. "She will do," he cried to Miss Taper. "Perfect. I wouldn't ask for anything better." Then he turned to me and asked, "Are you looking for a position as a governess, miss?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "And what salary are you asking for?" "I earned £4 a month at my last job, sir," I told him. "Tut, tut, a mere nothing," he cried. Here's a picture of her telling her story, and then there's the man and the lady who's trying to get her a position. I think that it's got these funny lines around it because it's like telling a story. It's like her flashback. A flashback is in a story when someone's telling something about something that happened in the past. In the story, you're like flashing back to like a previous time. They do it in movies as well. Okay. "I would not think of paying you less than £100 a year, which would be, wait a second, £4. She was getting £4 a month, so that would have been 40. It would have been about $50. So he's gonna like double her money. So that's a lot. Wow, double salary. "You may imagine, Mr. Holmes, that as poor as I was, such an offer seemed too good to be true. But when the gentleman saw the doubt in my face, he immediately offered to pay me half my first year's salary in advance. How thoughtful it was, especially since I had many debts to pay. Yet something seemed strange about this whole situation. and I felt I needed to know more before I gave him an answer. So I began by asking where he lived. In Hampshire, he replied, a charming country house called Copper Beeches. And my duties, sir? I asked. One child, a dear little lad of 6, he said with a laugh, quite skillful at killing cockroaches with a slipper. Smack, 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 and 3 are gone in a wink. I was a bit startled, Mr. Holmes, at the boy's idea of fun, but I assumed that the father was joking, and then I asked if there were any other requirements or duties. Only to obey any other little orders my wife might give, nothing out of the ordinary, he said, then added, but would you object to wearing any dress we might give you? Just a little whim of ours. No, sir, I replied, rather surprised. And if we asked you to sit in a certain chair, would you be agreeable? Certainly, sir, I replied, but my amazement was increasing. And would you cut your hair short? I could hardly believe my ears, Mr. Holmes. As you can see, I have long, thick, luxuriant hair, of which I have always been quite proud, and I couldn't dream of sacrificing it to suit someone's whim. So to this request I replied, I'm afraid that's quite impossible. His smiling face darkened, and he said, I'm afraid it will be necessary. It is a little fancy of my wife's. Are you certain you won't? That's really weird. I really cannot, I answered firmly. At that point, Miss Taper looked at me with annoyance. She was understandably upset at losing a good commission. Well, Miss Hunter, she said, sputtered, it seems useless for us to keep you on our register since you are refusing such an excellent offer. Well, Mr. Holmes, when I returned home to my small room with little food in the cupboard and several unpaid bills on the table, I began to wonder if I hadn't been foolish. These people might be eccentric, but eccentric means like strange or like having weird like tastes. Like I had a neighbor when I was growing up who liked to put bowling balls in his yard, like as decoration. He would just like place them around the yard. He probably had like 20 or 30. And you didn't like notice them at first, but then you stopped and looked and you're like, hey, that's a bowling ball. And there's another bowling ball. And they're like different colors. And yeah, that is eccentric. Let's see. But they were willing to pay for this eccentricity. Besides, my hair might be coming short. I thought this way for 3 days. And at this point of returning to the agency to see if the position was still available, when I received this letter from the gentleman himself. Sherlock Holmes took the letter Violet Hunter handed him and began to read. The Copper Beeches, Winchester, dear Mrs. Hunter. My wife is very impressed with my description of you and is anxious for you to come. We are willing to increase our offer to £120 a year, so as to pay you for any inconvenience our little fancies may cause you. My wife is quite fond of a shade of blue called electric blue, and would like you to wear a dress of that color in the mornings. You need not go to the expense of buying one, as we have one here belonging to my daughter Alice, who now lives in Philadelphia in the USA. It will fit you quite well. However, I must remain quite firm upon the point of cutting your hair. I am aware of its beauty, but I hope that your increase in salary will make up for its loss. Yours faithfully, Jeffro Rucastle. When he had finished reading, Sherlock Holmes returned the letter to Violet Hunter and sat back in his chair. And what have you decided to do? He asked. I decided to accept the position, but before I inform Mr. Rucastle of my decision, I would like your opinion of what these strange conditions could possibly mean. Do you think Mr. Rucastle's wife is a lunatic, and he simply wishes to humor her fancies? It's possible, said Holmes. In any case, this is not a position which I would permit my own sister to apply for. But the money, Mr. Holmes. Yes, the pay is good, too good. I fear, why should they give you £120 a year when they could get any of the finest governesses in England for £40? Yes, there is something strange and mysterious behind that. Exactly, Mr. Holmes, cried Miss Hunter, and that is why I've come to you. I wanted you to know everything, so that if I needed your help while I was at Mr. Rucastle's, here's her and Sherlock Holmes talking. By all means, Miss Hunter, said Holmes. If you should find yourself in danger, be it day or night, a telegram would bring me to your help immediately. You have eased my mind considerably, Mr. Holmes, said Violet Hunter, as she rose from her chair smiling. Now, I shall sacrifice my poor hair tonight and leave for Winchester tomorrow. Good night, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, and thank you both. As Violet Hunter shut the door behind her, Watson turned to Holmes, saying, Violet Hunter seems to be a fine young lady who is able to take care of herself. She will need to, said Holmes, with a worried look on his face. If I'm not mistaken, we will hear from her before many days pass. During the next 2 weeks, Sherlock Holmes sat for many hours with that same worried look on his face. Finally, late one night, the expected telegram arrived. Watson, cried Holmes after reading the message. A telegram is like a letter, but they sent it over the wire, and so you would have it delivered to your house, not like through the postman. They would come, it was supposed to be like speedy delivery, sort of like the first like fast way to communicate with somebody. Kind of like today's email, but someone would have to like bring you the piece of paper from the telegram office. We must leave for Winchester tomorrow. Miss Hunter pleads with us to meet her at noon at the Black Swan Inn. She fears she is at her wit's end. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson boarded the 9:30 train from London for the 2-hour ride to Winchester. Watson was enthused at the countryside on a beautiful spring day, but Holmes was not impressed by its beauty. No, Watson, he said, I cannot see the beauty. I look at the countryside and think how scattered the farmhouses are and how easily a crime committed there would go unnoticed. I fear for Violet Hunter's safety. But she must be free to come and go, said Watson. Since she is meeting us at the Winchester, she's obviously not being personally threatened. True, said Holmes, but I still fear danger. When Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson arrived at the Black Swan Inn, Violet Hunter was already there. She had rented a sitting room and had ordered lunch for the three of them. I'm delighted that you both came, she said eagerly. I need your advice. What's happened to you? Asked Holmes. I will tell you, but I must be quick. I promised Mr. Rucastle to be back before 3 o'clock. Then tell us everything that has happened, said Holmes, as they sat down to lunch in the sitting room. To begin, Mr. Holmes, I have not had any actual bad treatment from Mr. and Mrs. Rucastle, but I cannot understand them and the reasons for their behavior. When I arrived here 2 weeks ago, Mr. Rucastle met me with his cart and drove me to the Copper Beeches, which is named for the clump of beech trees, okay, at the front of the door. And the copper color is like a brownish, goldish color, so the gold-colored trees. I was introduced to Mrs. Rucastle and the child, Edward. I soon discovered that the concerns of Mrs. Rucastle's sanity, which we discussed 2 weeks ago in London, were unfounded. She is not mad, only a silent, pale woman, much younger than her husband. I take him for about 45 and her for about 30. They have been married 7 years. He had been a widower, he told me, and his only child, a 20-year-old daughter, had gone to Philadelphia because she did not get along with her stepmother. Tell me more about Mrs. Rucastle, said Holmes. She is a rather colorless person, but passionately devoted to her husband and their little son. She seems to have some secret sorrow, though, and I often see her deep in thought, with the saddest look on her face. More than once I found her in tears. I thought perhaps it might be because her son, for never have I met such a spoiled and bad-tempered little creature. Here he is right here. There's her watching the kid throw a temper tantrum, I'm assuming. All right. He divides his time between savage anger and gloomy sulking. This one amusement is to inflict pain on any creature weaker than himself. Oh, that's terrible. Like capturing mice, birds, or insects. He has little to do with my story, Mr. Holmes. Not so, said Sherlock Holmes. All these details are important, but whether they seem so to you or not. The only unpleasant thing about the house is the 2 servants. A man and his wife. Taller is a rough, uncouth man with a constant smell of liquor on him. I have seen him drunk twice in the last 2 weeks, but Mr. Rucastle seems to overlook it. Mrs. Taller is a tall, strong woman with a sour face. They are unpleasant, but devoted to the Rucastles. Well, Miss Hunter, said Holmes, so far nothing is that out of the ordinary. Nothing was, Mr. Holmes, said Miss Hunter, for the first 2 days. But on the morning of the 3rd day, Mrs. Rucastle whispered something to her husband at the breakfast table. Both of them looked at me as I sat there puzzled. Then Mr. Rucastle spoke. My wife and I are pleased that you agreed to indulge our whim by cutting your hair, Miss Hunter. Now we wish you to wear that electric blue dress I spoke to you about. You will find it laid out on your bed. Well, I went up to my room, Mr. Holmes, and the dress I found waiting there was a peculiar shade of blue, an excellent material, but definitely worn before. However, it fit as perfectly as it had been made for me. I put it on and when joined Mr. and Mrs. Rucastle in the drawing room, both were delighted with my appearance. Mr. Rucastle motioned me to a chair which had been placed close to the middle of the 3 large windows overlooking the front of the house. As I sat with my back to the window, Mr. Rucastle began to walk up and down on the other side of the room, all the while telling me of some of the funniest stories I've ever heard. I laughed until I was quite weary. Mrs. Rucastle, however, was evidently in no sense of humor, sat with a sad, anxious face, and never once smiled. Finally, after an hour, Mr. Rucastle ceased, then told me I might change my clothes and attend to my duties with little Edward in the nursery. Was this the only time such an incident occurred? Asked Holmes. No, Mr. Holmes. 2 days later, the same performance took place. This time, after I had been laughing at Mr. Rucastle's funny stories for nearly an hour, he handed me a book, and after moving my chair sideways so my shadow wouldn't fall upon the page, he asked me to read to him. I read for about 10 minutes, and suddenly, in the middle of a sentence, he ordered me to stop, change my dress, and return to my duties. Is that the entire story? Asked Dr. Watson. No, sir. As the days went on, I became, and here's her sitting down in a chair with the wife behind her and him telling stories. Weird, huh? They're definitely hiding something. As the days went on, I became more and more curious about these unusual performances. Mr. Rucastle was always so careful to turn my face away from the window that I started having the wildest desires to see behind me. At first it seemed impossible, but I soon came up with an idea. My hand mirror had broken during my trip to the Copper Beeches, so I now hid a piece of glass in my handkerchief. During Mr. Rucastle's next performance, my laughter brought tears to my eyes, so I had the opportunity to bring my handkerchief to my face. I must confess, Mr. Holmes, that I was somewhat disappointed. All I saw was a man standing in the road looking in my direction. He was a small, bearded man, in a gray suit. I lowered my handkerchief and saw Mrs. Rucastle staring at me intently. I'm certain she guessed I had a mirror in my hand, for she rose at once and informed her husband that someone in the road was staring at me. A friend of yours, Mrs. Hunter? Mr. Rucastle asked me. No, sir, I replied, for I know no one in our round Winchester. Then kindly motion for him to go away. But, sir, I protested, wouldn't it be better to ignore him? No, otherwise he'll be loitering around here all the time. Please, Miss Hunter, turn around and wave him away. I did as I was told, Mr. Holmes. Then Mr. Rucastle immediately closed the drapes. That was a few days ago, and from that day on I have not sat at the window, nor worn the blue dress, nor seen the man in the road. Your story is most interesting, Miss Hunter, said Holmes. Please continue. On that very first day that I was sat at the Copper Beeches, Mr. Rucastle took me to a small shed near the kitchen door. As we approached it, I heard the rattling of a chain and the sound of a large animal moving about. Pointing to a slit between 2 planks, Mr. Rucastle said, Look through here, Miss Hunter. Isn't she a beauty? I looked through the slit and saw 2 glowing eyes and a shadowy figure huddled in the darkness. Don't be frightened, said Mr. Rucastle, laughing. It's only Carlo, my mastiff. Toller feeds him only once a day and lets him loose every night on the grounds. God help the trespasser that guard dog gets his fangs into. He warned me not to go out at night either. Strange that your employer should need to guard his grounds in such a violent manner, commented Dr. Watson. Yes, Dr. Watson, agreed Violet Hunter, and it was chilling to see that huge animal walking across the lawn at night. Has anything else happened that might be considered unusual? Asked Holmes. I was just coming to that, Mr. Holmes. As you know, I had cut off my hair in London. And here's a picture of her looking at the dog, and they kind of like cut out a hole from the shed so you can see the dog inside what she's looking at. Poor animal. All right. I've only got like 1 page left. Let's see. I cut off my hair in London. It was a large curl, and I kept it. It was in the bottom of my trunk. Well, one evening, after young Edward was in bed, I began to examine the furniture in my room. There was an old 3-drawer dresser. The 2 top drawers had been opened when I arrived, so I put my things in them, but the bottom drawer was locked. On this particular evening, I was trying to decide where to put the things I hadn't yet unpacked, when I realized that I didn't have the use of the 3rd drawer. Thinking it had been locked by mistake, I took out my bunch of keys for the house and found one that fit. When I opened the drawer, I found my curl of hair. I took it out, examined it, the same color, the same thickness. But how can it be? I asked myself. How can my hair be locked in the drawer? My hands trembled as I opened my trunk and tossed out what few clothes remained in it. And there, from the bottom, I drew out my own curl of hair. See, she's got two of them now. Hers and then somebody else's that looks like hers. That's concerning. I placed mine next to the one I had found in the drawer and found them to be identical. Naturally, this puzzled me greatly, but I did not mention it to the Rucastles, since I really had no right opening a locked drawer. That certainly is puzzling, said Holmes. Now, is that all Watson and I should know? Just one more thing, Mr. Holmes. There is a wing of the house which appears to be uninhabited. The door of the Tollers' rooms faced the door to this wing, but this door was always locked. One day, time for school. Where were we? One day, however, as I reached the top of the stairs, I saw Mr. Rucastle coming out of the store, his keys in his hand, but his face, which I had always seen smiling and pleasant, was now red and crinkled in anger, with veins standing out at his temples as if ready to burst. He locked the door and hurried past me without a word or a look. Ah, Miss Hunter, said Dr. Watson, smiling, so I'm sure that with your curiosity and fine powers of observation, you found the answer to the mystery. Okay, one more paragraph. I'm afraid, Dr. Watson, in fact, I have become more curious, even more terrified. How so? Asked Holmes. The following day I took Edward for a stroll around parts of the grounds from which I could see the wing. 4 windows looked out, but 3 were simply dirty, but the 4th was shuttered up. As I strolled along, glancing up at the windows from time to time, Mr. Rucastle came out, just looking as smiling and jovial as ever. You seem to be curious about this wing, Miss Hunter, he said. I use it for my hobby, photography. That shuttered window is my dark room. He spoke gaily, but his eyes showed suspicion and annoyance. At that moment, I realized that those rooms contained some secret which I was not supposed to know, and my curiosity then made me want to discover what that secret was. All right, so we're going to stop right there. So there's a lady at a house. She's been asked to wear weird clothes and cut her hair, and she's found somebody else's hair. That's really strange. I feel like there's somebody that she's like pretending to be or something, or covering up for something. I don't know, but we'll have to find out tomorrow. Until then, I'll see you guys later.